I'm going to turn the microphone over to Professor Brian Surgenor now. Professor Surgenor is from Queen's University, a professor of mechanical and materials engineering, and he will be leading the panel. Brian?
So one more plea to ask people to take their seats. We're all conscious of the time. I have the pleasure this afternoon of chairing the session that's entitled The Future of Manufacturing in Ontario. Of course, with the theme of the conference being public policy, the subtitle is what public policy issues are needed to promote manufacturing in Ontario, given its strategic importance. Again, mentioning the matter of time, this is a relatively short session. There's only 1 hour allotted to it. Speakers are going to try to keep themselves to about 10 minutes, which hopefully will leave us about 15 minutes for questions. Being from Kingston, the word rush hour is somewhat foreign to me, but it's kind of a scary word in Toronto, I'm told. With that, I'm going to keep my introductions to the speakers very, very brief. I just want to remind you that more detailed bios are in the pamphlet for the conference. On my immediate right, Nigel Southway is the owner of Nexus Consulting Service. He's currently the chair of the Toronto chapter of the Society of Manufacturing Engineers, and he is a leading proponent of TBM, which you'll hear quite a bit about in the next 20 minutes. Juan Gomez is not Carol Wadley, who's in the program. He's very graciously taken her place. She was unable to come. Juan is the Director of Policy, Toronto Board of Trade, same organization, where he provides advice on public policy, government relations, and city-region development issues. Our final speaker, or rather our final introduction on the far right, will be our first speaker, Jim Stanford. He's an economist with the Canadian Auto Workers, and he writes an economics column for the Globe and Mail. With that, I'm going to turn the mic right over to Jim so we could get things going.
All right, good afternoon. Thank you, Brian. Thank you very much for the conference organizers for the invitation to participate. Beautiful Friday afternoon. It's total patio weather out there. You guys have worked hard all day. And what do you get? The Economist. That's okay. You're an engineer, so the feeling of intimidation is mutual here. I'm an economist. That means I'm someone who's good with numbers but didn't have the personality to be an accountant. So I don't know what your excuse is. Engineers. Do you still use slide rules, by the way? My father was an engineer. He tried to teach me on the slide rule. No, okay, fine. Worse yet, I'm a labor union economist. Of course, union economist, you probably think that's a contradiction in terms, kind of like military intelligence, right? Or ethical investment, progressive conservative. What's the new one I was thinking of? Classic alternative. Does anybody get XM radio? Anyone listen to XM radio? See, I listen to the First Wave, channel 19 or something like that, and it's called Classic Alternative. So I'm listening to it one day. My daughter hears them say, First Wave, the Classic Alternative. And she says, Daddy, Classic Alternative. Get real. There's no such thing as classic alternative. It's classic, it's not alternative. But union economists, I think we actually do have a role to play, and I think we're very grateful to have the interest from the engineering community, Nigel's group, the Society of Manufacturing Engineers, and of course the whole conference to recognize the importance of manufacturing, not just for your career paths as engineers, although that's certainly important and legitimate, but for the prosperity of our whole society and for the quality of the jobs that we can create and leave for my 16-year-old daughter who has no respect whatsoever for classic alternative music, but who still deserves a good job in the future. And as engineers, you've shared the gains from the organized labor perspective, the gains that workers have enjoyed over the years from a strong manufacturing sector. And more recently, as engineers in the field, you've shared the pains in terms of the downsizing, the loss of opportunities, the kind of stunted nature of Canada's manufacturing sector, the underdeveloped opportunities in terms of the proprietary work on technology that you folks are doing. I think of a recent tragic story like the closure of the Caterpillar plant in London where the company was successful, operated for decades, and had, apart from the good quality working class jobs there, it also had a strong contingent of engineering and scientific personnel who were working on developing the intellectual capital for what was a very sophisticated value-added activity, namely these diesel-electric locomotives, very specialized. And they were collateral victims just like the workers were. When Caterpillar took over the plant, the government required no commitment from Caterpillar in terms of their intentions, and then barely a year later closed the plant and moved it elsewhere. And that's a tragedy for the engineers who worked there as much as it is for the workers. I want to start by just a few words about what's special about manufacturing. Why should we care about manufacturing? I don't think that manufacturing is just another sector of the economy. I don't think we're looking for favoritism or subsidies when we say that manufacturing deserves special attention from policymakers. There are core economic features of manufacturing as an activity that explain why we should be giving focused attention to manufacturing. Number one, it is disproportionately reliant on innovation. Manufacturing sector, which now accounts for maybe 12% of Canada's GDP, accounts for well over half of all business sector research and development activity because of the nature of the products and the nature of the processes that are amenable to innovation. So if we lose manufacturing, we lose a big chunk of our innovation capacity as a nation, and we all know that Canada's record in that regard is terrible. Related point number two is the productivity of manufacturing. Again, because of the inherent capital-intensive nature, the amenability to mechanization, productivity levels and productivity growth rates are both substantially higher in manufacturing than in other activities in the economy. That means if you've got a larger manufacturing sector, your national productivity performance is going to be stronger just because of the pure arithmetic, and you don't need a slide rule to figure that out. Canada's manufacturing sector has demonstrated tremendous productivity performance within the sector. The problem is the sector has been shrinking so much that we are not making the contribution to Canadian productivity performance that we could. Number three, the reliance on fixed capital investment. In order to have innovation pay off in terms of productivity and standard of living, you have to embody it in new capital investment, equipment, machinery, and so on. And manufacturing, again, accounts for a disproportionate share of capital investment. Number four, because productivity levels are higher, that means incomes in manufacturing can be higher, about 20% higher than the average in Canada as a whole. And that generates spin-off benefits through the economy in terms of knock-on job creation as the incomes that are generated in manufacturing are spent. Number five is the global engagement of manufacturing. Well over half of manufacturing output in Canada is exported, and the fact that this is an inherently tradable product with a strong foothold in global markets or international markets gives us a head start in our international trade. Every country has to pay its bills in international trade, so by virtue of having a stronger domestic presence for an industry that does export, you are going to give yourself a head start in being able to pay those bills. Having an export-oriented industry, in essence, relaxes the balance of payments constraint on your national output and employment performance and gives you a better shot at paying your bills internationally. Manufacturing, of course, is not the only industry that satisfies that criteria. Some other industries, resources, agriculture, some tradable services are also tradable products in that economic sense, but manufacturing is a very important one. So those are all legitimate structural material reasons why manufacturing is not just another sector and why government policymakers should pay some focused attention to manufacturing and not in the sense of bailing anyone out or offering favors for somebody or it being a hard luck case in terms of an investment that we make collectively as society in an industry that is important not just to those who work in manufacturing but in every sector of the economy. So that leads to the question of what shall we do to try and support manufacturing and enhance our domestic manufacturing footprint as we go forward. I reject the idea that the decline in manufacturing activity that has been experienced in Canada over the last few years is a normal outcome. Some people who are sort of saying, don't worry about manufacturing, it's destined to decline because we're evolving into a post-industrial economy, are all wrong. Even though manufacturing may decline as a share of total GDP, a lot of that reflects accounting issues such as outsourcing, where work that used to be done within a manufacturing firm is now purchased from an outside supplier who actually shows up in the data as being in the services industry. And if you track through the input-output linkages, as we have done through the Ontario Manufacturing Council in a study of how all of the different sectors in Ontario's economy depend on manufacturing, you'll see that there is no such thing as a post-industrial economy. There is no such thing as an information economy. We still, in our day-to-day lives, very much depend on manufactured products and all of the inputs that go into those products. Canada's decline in manufacturing in the last 5 years was not normal. It's not a universal trend. We suffered disproportionately from a decline in our relative manufacturing footprint, which means the manufacturing is still occurring. It's just not occurring here. And so then the policy challenge for us becomes how do we keep it here? The first step, I'd say, is to recognize that we need a manufacturing policy. They say in the addictions counseling world, recognizing you have a problem is half of the solution. And I think the analogy here is valid as well. The traditional thinking among government thinkers in Ottawa these days has been, no, we're not going to pick favorites, we're not going to pick winners, we'll let market forces and market forces alone decide what Canada is going to do and what Canadians are going to do. And the whole idea of having a focused manufacturing policy strategy is contradictory to that view. If we follow that sort of hands-off, laissez-faire approach to structural policy, we will absolutely end up as a hewer of wood, drawer of water, and nowadays a scraper of tar. Our so-called natural role in global markets will be to provide resources to others who then process those resources, add value to them, and sell them back to us at a premium. So in that sort of a world, you can imagine where the jobs and the incomes are going to go. Other countries in the world do not follow that. If you look at the success stories in Europe, like Germany or Finland, in Asia, like Japan, Korea, and now China, or in emerging economies like Brazil, in every case, the governments have recognized that they're going to take a proactive leadership role in ensuring that those countries have at least a proportionate role in the production and export of manufacturers. And Canada, I think, should do the same. Lesson number 2 in the policy world is it takes all stakeholders together to design a policy and to implement a policy to be all pulling in the same direction. It's not just a matter for the private companies who open the enterprises, make the capital investments. Government has to be there. Labor has to be there. The scientific and educational community has to be there. We have to be lining up our ducks in society to make sure that manufacturing is seen as a goal. Number 3, we have a number of lessons to learn in terms of how we're engaging with the world economy in our manufactured goods. And I think Canada needs to engage with global trade and investment flows strategically rather than ideologically. Yes, manufacturing has to be global because of the specialized nature of the output. We have to be designing our products for export. And in fact, that's one of the benefits that I mentioned of why manufacturing matters. But we shouldn't put on Boy Scout uniforms and go out into the world economy and say, okay, we're Canadians, we always play by the rules, let's go for it. That's the approach that we have been following by signing free trade agreements and then assuming that that is going to lead to equal allocation of investment and employment opportunities. And that's not working for us either in trade itself. We have 10 years ago, Canada pulled its own weight in global manufacturing output. That is, we produced as much manufacturing output as we consumed, and we had a balanced manufacturing trade relationship. Now, today, we have a $100 billion annual manufacturing trade deficit, and we have so-called free trade agreements with countries who view us as a market opportunity for sure, but have no intention whatsoever of buying back our products from us, and that approach cannot continue. Same goes for investment and how we welcome foreign investment. CAW members work in all kinds of industries that wouldn't exist without foreign investment. So to say that we're opposed to foreign investment is nonsense. But what we have to do is be strategic and hands-on in terms of how we attract and recruit that investment and what we expect from foreign investors. And this idea, the extreme case being Caterpillar, where we invite foreign investors in regardless of what their plans are, how they treat Canadians, and then continue to purchase their products no matter what they do here. That approach is very, very naive and undermines our perspective in the long run. Finally, just to spark the discussion, I think we have a lot of Canadian strengths and markets and assets that we could leverage if we were conscious and proactive about using everything in our toolbox to support Canadian manufacturing. For example, we've got lots of resources, and Canada is obviously going to be a major resource producer and exporter. But there are important manufactured inputs that go into the extraction of resources, and then there are important value-added opportunities associated with those resources in the manufacturing sector, which could also occur here. So we can choose to just dig stuff out of the ground using capital equipment that we import from elsewhere and then sell the raw product, okay? And at the end of the day, we'll be left with a big hole in the ground. On the other hand, if we say we've got this stuff in the ground, we've got some control and leverage over how it is extracted and sold, let's put some pressure on. Let's push the companies involved to use more Canadian inputs in the process. Instead of buying those huge trucks in the tar sands from Caterpillar, which we do, a company that just slapped the whole country in the face with their actions in London, why don't we buy them from companies that have a footprint in Canada? Or even better yet, why don't we go to Caterpillar before they decide to shut down their only manufacturing facility in Canada and say, listen, if you do that, we're not going to buy those things anymore. Because guess what? It's our resources that we're digging out. That would be a way to influence Caterpillar's decision before it got made. Other countries in the world absolutely do that. And then instead of exporting the raw bitumen, why don't we put in place a value-added capacity to process that bitumen, to add value to it, to convert it into more useful products. That's how a proactive policy strategy works. You look around at what you've got, who the other players are, who the other stakeholders are, what assets you have, and as long as you have in your head the strategic goal of combining those assets almost in an entrepreneurial way, policy can make a big difference, rather than sitting back and saying, I'll accept whatever the free market forces deliver. Because again, if that is our approach, we will not nearly have the potential wealth creation that the manufacturing sector could give us in the future. I want to recommend, just in closing, a couple of documents online where we kind of map out this approach in further. Number one is my union, the CAW, just this past month released a major policy vision for how to protect, develop, and grow Canada's auto industry in the future, contrary to those, again, who pessimistically think the industry is all destined for Mexico and there's nothing that we can do about it. It's got a dedicated website called rethinktheeconomy.ca, rethinktheeconomy.ca, that lists 10 specific ways that we think an active policy framework could support the auto industry going forward as a case study in proactive manufacturing policies. The second document that I'll mention is one that I wrote for an outfit called the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, a think tank in Ottawa, and it's called A Cure for Dutch Disease. A Cure for Dutch Disease. If you Googled that with my name, you would find that easily. And that is, again, a kind of point-by-point list of the sorts of policies that I'm talking about today, where government could push against the tendencies that are trying to force Canada to specialize in resource extraction and nothing else, and try and produce a more well-rounded and sustainable economy as we go forward. So that's my view on why manufacturing matters and what we can do about it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this event and being part of such a strong panel of experts on manufacturing. My comments today are going to take a distinctively Toronto City region perspective on the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead for our manufacturers. I'll first focus a bit of time looking at manufacturing through an urban economic development lens and explore global trends and what they portend for local manufacturers. I'll then briefly talk about some of the key pieces in the broader policy and business environment that we need to have in place if manufacturing is going to continue to have a viable future, not only in the Toronto region, but indeed Ontario and Canada. As a member-based organization, which includes many significant manufacturing firms in the Toronto region, The Board of Trade is acutely aware of the significant and complex role that manufacturers play across many of our region's key industry clusters. We connect over 10,000 members and 200,000 business professionals in Canada's largest city and region, Toronto. It's home to over 5 million residents and almost half of the province's labor force. It accounts for nearly 50% of Ontario's GDP and 20% of Canada's GDP, a proportion that's larger than international city regions like London and New York City. And as the Toronto Board of Trade highlighted in its most recent scorecard on prosperity, the Toronto region is also a solid performer in major industry clusters such as auto and parts, aerospace, and health and life sciences, and also food and beverage, all of which have at their core manufacturing as a key element of their productive processes. Accounting for over 15% of the Toronto region's economy, manufacturing continues to play a vital role in securing the growth and prosperity of the Toronto region. Moreover, and what's important to stress, is that it builds in a measure of stability and diversity into what is increasingly a services and construction-oriented economy. History shows that putting too many of your economic eggs in one basket, whether finance, natural resources, or even manufacturing, weakens the resilience of cities, regions, and countries to weather the inevitable ups and downs of the global economy. Certainly, economic data suggests a positive link between industrial diversity and long-run urban success. In many ways, it's no different from an investment portfolio. Just ask anyone who bet the house on the dot-com or the real estate bubbles of decades past. This is something not lost on Ed Glazer, an urban economist from Harvard University. Commenting in this spring's issue of City Journal, Glazer notes that the city of New York would be wise to lessen its over-reliance on the financial industry. He advocates exploring new opportunities to grow businesses in areas like advanced sciences and engineering services, which are conducive to a dense urban setting like New York City. With good reason, between 2008 and 2009, that city's payroll fell by a staggering $35 billion, with more than 4/5 of that loss in finance and insurance payrolls. It's this reality, as Glazer highlights in his article, that New York recently made a bold bet to support industrial diversity. It's encouraging an applied science campus on Roosevelt Island between Manhattan and Queens. After holding a tough international competition, the city awarded the land plus $100 million worth of infrastructure support to Cornell University. The connection between education and metropolitan success is empirically robust. Research from the U.S. shows that an area with a land-grant university before 1940 is likelier to enjoy economic success today. As Glazer correctly argues, the Roosevelt Island investment seems like a wise gamble, even with some of the inherent risks around potential for connecting with existing engineering efforts and whether the center can in fact generate enough spin-offs. However, for a dense urban region with strong human capital and intellectual capital, developing a specialty in applied science and engineering seems more than plausible. What the New York City example illustrates, as well, is a renewed interest from policymakers in the U.S. and other jurisdictions on the role of advanced engineering, applied sciences, and manufacturing, and the role these sectors can play in spurring economic growth. Having said all this, it's worth stressing that manufacturing is very much different from many decades ago. The vast industrial parks of the past have given way to much smaller production footprint and workforce. The flip side of the spectacular growth in manufacturing output globally is the decline in manufacturing-related employment. Part of this story is we're producing more with less, in large measure because of new technology and automation. Although it's undoubtedly true that manufacturing has more than demonstrated its resilience post-recession, what does the future hold? First, with many of the great challenges still facing us, from producing clean, affordable energy to feeding an ever-growing world population, it's safe to say that manufacturing processes will continue to play a central role in bringing these solutions to market. And how these solutions are delivered are being radically transformed by digital technologies, which are already transforming how goods and services are delivered in the retail and media sectors. As The Economist vividly highlights in an article also picked up by the Globe and Mail, Neil Reynolds, the old way of making things involved taking lots of parts and screwing or welding them together. Now a product can be designed on a computer and printed on a 3D printer, which creates a solid object by building up successive layers of material. The same article describes the implications of this digital revolution on how the manufacturing workplace is organized. Most jobs might not be on the factory floor, but in offices nearby, which will be full of designers, engineers, IT specialists, logistics experts, and marketing staff. And critically, the manufacturing jobs of the future will also require much more skills. Now, in a trend that challenges some conventional wisdom, offshore production is increasingly moving back to rich countries, not just because Chinese wages are rising, but because companies now want to be closer to their customers so they can respond more quickly to changes in demand. And some products are just so sophisticated that it helps to have the people who design them and the people to make them in the same place. The Boston Consulting Group estimates that in areas such as transport, computers, fabricated metals, and machinery, 10 to 30% of the goods that America now imports from China could be made at home by 2020, boosting American output by $20 to $55 billion a year. So the question then is, how do we boost manufacturing in the Toronto region and Canada? While the recovery and technological opportunities now unfolding for manufacturing are both heartening and exciting, we can't ignore the challenges that were already weighing on the sector prior to the recession, from a high dollar to competition from high-growth countries in Asia and Latin America, none of which have gone away. So the question is, how do we position ourselves as a region to ensure our manufacturing sector capitalizes on these emerging trends and continues to thrive? Ultimately, part of the answer is about competitiveness. In other words, the ability of our firms to compete in global markets. And to compete globally, we have to be more productive in how we deploy our human capital and natural resources. Despite our firms being more productive than they've ever been, our competition has also upped its game. And by many measures, including the board's scorecard on prosperity, across many benchmarks, they're leaving us behind. So what's to be done? How do we grow and strengthen manufacturing in this very competitive landscape? To some extent, we have to look at our macro environment and supporting policies and investments undertaken by federal, provincial, and municipal governments. One obvious example is underinvestment in transportation infrastructure, which the board has long argued is central to securing our region's economic prosperity. Overstretched transportation networks are becoming a major barrier to growing the economy of the Toronto region, which accounts for almost 50% of Ontario's GDP, as I indicated earlier. In economic terms, the impacts are massive, with up to $6 billion in lost productivity, a number projected to grow up to $15 billion by 2031. Transportation bottlenecks in the Toronto region are causing increased delays and disruptions within major provincial supply chains in such critical industries as food processing, advanced manufacturing, and transportation and logistics. Improvements on this front would therefore have a major economic payoff for the province, particularly on our levels of productivity. As well, it's important to stress the broader economic upside for Ontario of new transit investment. For example, in addition to construction-related stimulus, major investments would spur demand for new transit vehicles, many of which are produced by Ontario-based manufacturers such as Bombardier. Along with the infrastructure investments, as Jim mentioned, there's also the hugely vital R&D function played by the country's post-secondary and public research institutions, a role critical in generating innovation and new products and ideas. It's relevant to note that in the U.S., more than half of private sector patents originate in university research. And in Canada, since 1999, research, discoveries, and innovation at Canadian universities have led to the creation of over 1,200 spin-off companies. But as we know, there still are issues with Canada's innovation ecosystem. Despite having a generous R&D tax credit regime, we still lag behind many of our international competitors. For this reason, the federal government is now looking at redirecting a portion of that R&D tax credit funds to more direct support for industry firms and research in universities. And it's an approach which has proven successful in other jurisdictions such as Finland and Israel. However, as a business organization, we're fully cognizant of the fact that the solution to productivity and growth within manufacturing does not reside solely with government. The simple fact is that people and businesses which drive and sustain economies do so in conjunction with sound governance. We therefore concur with Canada's central banker, Mark Carney, in his recent call out to business to refocus on developing new markets and retooling and investing in plant, ICT, and human capital. This brings us to an initiative the board is spearheading to grow and strengthen our leading industry clusters, including advanced manufacturing here in the Toronto region. By clusters, we refer to those groups of interconnected companies in a particular sector, such as aerospace or auto and parts, that are located close to one another. Significantly, clusters also include related institutions like universities, government, and trade associations, which support clusters in different ways through workforce training, sector supports, and advocacy. The board recently hosted a regional economics summit where a keynote speaker, Harvard's Dr. Michael Porter, convincingly argued that the fate of the region's firms and economy was inexorably linked to the health and dynamism of its key industry clusters. Porter laid out a blueprint for how the private sector could take a big role in transforming the business environment and help nurture those clusters best placed to compete nationally and internationally. Simply put, it was about building upon unique existing strengths and knowing what is distinct and unique in the region's business environment. For Porter, there was much to laud in the Toronto region. For example, Toronto's mix of multiple and related clusters such as aerospace and metal manufacturing offered great opportunities for synergies in such areas as R&D, education, and workforce training. Additionally, cultural factors such as a greater openness to immigration, better than many competing regions, including the U.S., augured well for the Toronto region's economic prospects, especially in the race to attract the world's best talent and entrepreneurs. A strong insight and message of Dr. Porter was the notion of collaborating to compete. Although counterintuitive for business to want to encourage growth and competition in their particular clusters, his research overwhelmingly made the case that new businesses were more apt to be profitable and stood a better chance of surviving over the long term within dense, highly competitive business clusters. Over the course of the year, we'll be bringing together key industry players from all sectors, including manufacturing, to collaborate and work on a series of cluster initiatives which can address some of the competitive challenges previously outlined. Although still early days, we envisage these initiatives tackling some of the major areas of business competitiveness where collaboration makes absolute sense, such as in skills development, upgrading supply chains, and supporting innovation and entrepreneurship. Based on experience from cluster initiatives in other jurisdictions, we could see manufacturing firms participating in research cooperatives within their field, mentoring local suppliers to upgrade their capabilities, and also working on internship and training programs. So to sum up, does manufacturing have a future? The answer is absolutely yes. But whether that future is in Canada, Ontario, or the Toronto region will depend on how effectively we get first the big things of governance, such as transit, higher education, and R&D investment right, along with micro-level elements in the business environment, like cluster development. So with that, thank you for your time and look forward to hearing your questions.